name is Harriet O'Neill, and I am Assistant Director for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the BSR. And this is part of our virtual programming to deal with lockdown and COVID. And so we've had a number of events, and we're always pleased that you can join us, and do follow us on Twitter. And we are recording this event if you have to leave. It's a pleasure to welcome Amy back. I've met her at the BSR on a couple of occasions when she's come to do short-term research with us and in Rome, but she actually had a 3-month fellowship with us in 2017 when she was looking at the commemoration of the Nasiriyah attack, and that was for her master's thesis. She then moved on, undertook a PhD, which she completed in 2019 at the University of Bristol. And then Amy remains a lecturer in Italian and liberal arts at Bristol again. She is currently writing her monograph, analysing the memory of Italy's 1917 Rogo di Primavera, a subject she addressed in a recent article in Modern Italy. Before I hand over to Amy, I want to explain that I will disappear and become the BSR logo, and I'll be on mute, but I am here and listening. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. It's really nice to have your questions and observations, and I'm sure Amy will welcome them. So thank you very much, Amy, for joining us tonight. We're really excited to hear about your research and how it's developed, so thank you.
Thanks, Harriet. I'm just going to set my screen sharing up a second.
Yeah.
Is that showing? Can you see that?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm going to talk a bit today about my research into transnational fascist martyrdom. And just to begin, I should say that this research is taken from an article that's forthcoming in Memory Studies, which analyses commemoration of fascist and anti-fascist martyrs in Italian communities of the US. It was the fascist element was one of those kind of research trails that you end up not looking at the time, but following up once you actually start going through your archival material. So I had a fellowship at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress during my PhD, and a stint at the Immigration History Research Center archive in Minnesota. And I kept thinking, I need to park this thing about the fascist martyrs in the US and come back to it, because I was researching actually Matteotti, memory of Giacomo Matteotti there. But then I found all this, when I actually got to looking at the material post-PhD, took a bit of a breather and had a look and found these amazing stories about these Italian American black shirt martyrs. So that's a long-winded way of saying that there's some holes in this that I would love to be able to fill by actually going back to Italy when I get the chance. I'm finding a few more bits of information out, but for now this is what I've got. So here we go. So on the 3rd of June 1927, New York Police Commissioner Joseph Warren banned any organisation whose appearance might lead to public disorder from parading in New York City. He did this as part of his public refusal to grant the Fascist League of North America permission to parade at the funeral of 2 Blackshirts, and that funeral was taking place the next day on the 4th, who had been killed on Memorial Day at the end of May. And that Memorial Day was particularly violent and turbulent, and there were violent protests from the Ku Klux Klan as well as the fascist Blackshirts. But thinking more about the Blackshirts today, the deaths of these 2 Italian fascists living in New York created the first Italian American fascist martyrs. And despite Joseph Warren's attempted ban, they would be mourned as such in public space in New York and in Naples. So who were these 2 men, and why was their funeral a point of public and police interest? So Carrisi was born in Reggio Calabria in 1889, and he'd arrived in the US in 1906, and he worked as a tailor there. And he actually joined the US Army during World War I in July 1918 before being discharged the following year. And on the 30th of May 1927, so the 1927 Memorial Day, he, along with around 14 other Blackshirts belonging to the Fascist League of North America, set off from his home in the Bronx to participate in the Memorial Day parade. And they'd been invited to do that by the American Legion. This opportunity allowed them to demonstrate their American patriotism and attempt to dispel any rumours of them as violent and unruly bullies. They had a very bad reputation for spontaneous violence at the time. And media accounts in the newspapers describe them as wearing these uniforms that Joseph Warren mentioned in my opening slide. So wearing black shirts, tasseled caps, jodhpurs, and carrying steel-tipped whips. So Carisi was buying a newspaper on the way to the station, and an unknown assailant, who was widely reported in the media to be an anti-fascist for his wearing of a red neckerchief, he was buying a newspaper and attacked by this unknown assailant. And while he was being attacked, Michele Ambrosoli, a Potenza-born printer who was known by a number of different names, and you can see here in this media outlet, he was called Nicholas Amoroso, Michele d'Ambrosoli, Niccolo d'Amoroso. It's very complicated, incorrect information in the media. But he was stabbed and shot coming to Carisi's help, and both Blackshirts died at the scene. So they belonged to a local fascio, a local fascist branch of the fascist party in the Bronx. And 6 years prior, on the 30th of April 1921, the first American branch of the Fasci all'estero, the Fasci abroad, opened in New York City. But by the mid to late 1920s, a number of them had been established in boroughs throughout New York, including a branch for women. And there were soon around 70 fasci in the United States, with membership totaling around 7,000, about 10% of which lived in New York. So these branches of the fascist party were charged with building the myth of the good Italian as one who dutifully and publicly served the duce from abroad. The main kind of principle that we'll come back to is that geographical distance from Italy was not to prevent devotion to fascism, as Commemoration of Carisi and Ambrosoli would show. And in fact, after Ambrosoli's death in 1927, a few months later, so in September that year, one of these fascia was set up in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, bearing his name. So back to the fasci, and much to Mussolini's discontent, the fasci often proved hard to control and did little to dispel perception of fascist violence. We can read in the dispatches of Washington Ambassador Gaetano Celazzani, sent to Mussolini. He writes of the reputation of leaders of the New York fasci all'estero as hardened criminals of low moral standing. The deaths of these two Italian American fascists, who were commemorated as Italian martyrs, as we'll see, gave Mussolini the chance to emphasize the suffering of local black shirts and underscore the violence of the regime's opponents. And using this sort of terminology of martyrdom, which draws attention to the fact that there is a killer, to be martyred requires a martyrer, for want of a better term. Mussolini was able to draw attention to the violence of the anti-fascists living in New York. Fascism continued to exert its influence in Italian American communities in the 20s, when the lodges of the Order of the Sons of Italy in America, which was the largest kind of formal organization for Italian Americans at the time, turned pro-fascist. The Catholic Church representatives in Little Italy's throughout North America had strong alliances with diplomatic representatives of Mussolini's regime. So that there was some kind of real hotbeds of fascist support in the States at this time, and lots of anti-fascist clashes as a result. So on the Memorial Day Parade of 1927, this, as I said, was a very violent and very disruptive day. And this image shows Blackshirts stopping a bus to look for the assailants shortly after the double murder. Their bodies, Carisi and Ambrosoli's bodies, lay in state at the local fascia in the Bronx for several days, and they were accompanied by an honor guard for that whole time. And according to an article in the New York Times on June the 2nd, hundreds visited the bodies as they lay in state. If you read the fascist press, it says thousands visited these bodies. And as they did so, they passed a cablegram sent by Augusto Turati, the General Secretary of the National Fascist Party, which was kind of pinned up on the bulletin board at the entrance, which read, "All the ferocity of the anti-fascisti cannot do anything against the glorious march of the idea." For every black shirt that falls, 1,000 are born, more brave and true. Kindly put flowers on the 2 bodies of the pure martyrs. Viva il duce e viva fascismo. So they were immediately honoured as martyrs, and this language was kind of immediately spread in the media and in the media in Italy and in the US. So the pair's funeral took place on the 4th of June and included a parade through the streets of New York, and you can see some of that pictured in these newspaper articles. And these parades were accompanied by floral arrangements, one of which spelled out Mussolini and white roses. According to Corriere della Sera, the procession attracted more than 50,000, including the Italian ambassador Di Martino, who flew in from Washington, DC, the Italian consul, representatives of the fasci, and representatives of the American veteran organizations. And throughout, we could see signifiers of Italian and North American national identity. These were kind of present through things like the flags, which I hope you can see in these slightly grainy images. This was very much a transnational event. A report in the fascist newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia described the covering of Carisi's casket with the US flag. So he, as I said, was enlisted in the American army during World War I, while Ambrosoli's was draped in the flag of Italy, highlighting these kind of transnational martyrological narratives. The Star-Spangled Banner was played as the body of Carisi was carried from the fascist headquarters and laid on this, I don't know the word for what you call this thing that carries a casket through public space, but as the body was laid onto that, the Star-Spangled Banner played. And as Ambrosoli's body was brought out of the local fasci headquarters, the Giovinezza was played. Both caskets were accompanied by uniformed US war veterans and Blackshirts who walked alongside the bodies until they reached the Italian church of Monte Carmelo. As they arrived at this church, speaking from the steps of in front of the church, Giacomo Caldora, president of the Il Duce Fascist Alliance, declared, "We are going to pay our last respects to these 2 Italian martyrs." He then called for their memory to be honoured rather than avenged. So again, kind of emphasising this idea of fascist non-violence and undermining the reputation of fascists as the violent ones in these clashes. And then a mass was held for the dead. Finally, the caskets were transported to a cemetery in the Bronx, accompanied by around 25 cars full of flowers, where they were temporarily buried in a public service. So that concludes the kind of American funeral. So that's the 4th of June. 10 days later, on the 14th, the bodies were loaded onto the Conte Rosso ocean liner and shipped back to Naples, which was the port from which both had actually left Italy for the US. So we see this kind of circular journey, them returning back to Italy, back to the port from where they'd left, positioning La Patria as their ultimate resting place. A brief aside, the Conte Rosso is quite an interesting part of the story. It made regular journeys from Geneva and Naples to the US, and then it went on actually to go to Argentina and even further afield, as far as Australia, I believe. It was also involved in other transatlantic reinterments. So the aviator Carlo del Prete in 1928 was kind of shipped back from South America. I'm not quite sure on that, but he was shipped back to Naples. So it was involved in kind of the movement of these bodies quite often. And it was run by Lloyd Sabaldo, the company Lloyd Sabaldo, founded in 1906 in Turin. The company had royal connections. It was supported by the Duke of Aosta's branch of the House of Savoy, so the Italian royal family. And by the 1920s, it was very much a growing business that had lots of capital and enough capital to do a sort of buy and build strategy, buying out other shipping businesses. So very much a successful Italian business and a sign of Italian prestige. So the bodies were loaded onto this Conte Rosso. The journeys made, still on the Conte Rosso here, but the journeys made by the ocean liner were part of Mussolini's imperial sort of strategy or would become part of Mussolini's imperial strategy and propaganda, and reflective of his his mission to portray Italy's imperial prestige. So hopefully the video is playing, but you can see footage from Archivio Luce, and this is an advert for a tourist cruise to Italian East Africa. And the ship was also used in 1935 to transport Italian troops to Ethiopia for the invasion of Ethiopia. And just generally throughout World War II, it carried soldiers to Africa Orientale. It was actually sunk in 1941 by the Royal Navy off the coast of Sicily, killing more than 1,000 Italian troops. And the poster on the left was produced under the fascist regime, and we can see this very clear kind of fascist futurist style. So just to say that the ship was very much tied up with the regime and its kind of projection of the image of Italian power. So on this journey back from New York to Naples, 6 uniformed Blackshirts formed a guard of honor for the duration of this journey, demonstrating that even, or maybe even especially in death, the fallen remained a central part of the regime, which had gone to huge lengths to honor and repatriate these bodies. And as you would see with fascist martyrs who had died in Italy, and their bodies were kind of moved to relevant places within the Italian borders, trains would carry these bodies across Italy during commemoration ceremonies, stopping at kind of relevant stations along the way and allowing people to come and pay their respects. So the journey of the train and the train stations became part of the ceremony's symbolic meaning, as Mabel Berezin has argued in her 1997 work. But here we see the journey of the Conte Rosso, and actually the very notion of the expanse of the Atlantic becoming an important part of the construction of this idea of transnational martyrdom, and part of the emphasis on this idea of repatriation and the Italian, Italy itself being the essential final resting place of Carrisi and Ambrosoli. This distance from La Patria wasn't to weaken the martyrological narrative. In fact, it very much strengthened the propagandistic power of the 2 deaths, which were upheld, as we'll see, of proof that ideological conviction could not be bound and should not be bound by the borders of the nation state. So just to play you a bit of footage of the return of the ship, crowds of 150,000, according to an article in Il Popolo d'Italia, welcomed the ship back to the dock in Naples on the 25th of June. So the bodies left on the 14th, returned on the 25th, and there was a lot of coverage in those, how many days, about 11 days of the return of the bodies, kind of building up this anticipation. So an article in Il Popolo d'Italia really stressed the importance of repatriating the bodies of these martyrs, and typifies this kind of imperialist rhetoric that is employed in commemoration of Carrisi and Ambrosoli. I'll just quote from this article. The fascist homeland has reclaimed the glorious bodies. Fascism does not want its martyrs to be buried in foreign lands and condemned to the solitude of cemeteries without flowers and sunshine. They must return here to the blessed land for which they knew to die. No tears for the 2 martyrs who fell in overseas lands like 2 soldiers on the battlefield, but pride, strength and honor for our fascist race, which never ceases to offer young blood to the sacred cause. Just a brief interlude here. I wanted to talk about this idea of translation of bodies in relation to martyrs and saints in a religious context, because I think that this journey on the Conte Rosso that I've just outlined was an example of this kind of transnational fascist translation of fascist martyrs. So from the Latin to transport or transfer from one location to another, these official ceremonies were held to honour the relocation of hallowed remains of saints or martyrs, so either their remains or their relics, to a place of great significance. And they were very formal events, formal rituals. They would often become feast days in their own right. There were a lot of them after 787, when all Christian churches had to contain a relic in order to be properly consecrated. So there was this kind of great movement of relics and remains. But I think that's exactly what we see with the process of the Conte Rosso bringing back the bodies from New York to Naples in a secular fascist context. And in fact, Carisi's body would go through another one of these translation ceremonies in the 1930s. I think it was 1939 when his body is incorporated into a mausoleum for fascist martyrs built in Reggio Calabria, where he was from. And we see a lot of this in the 1930s with the creation of large sacrarian mausoleums for fascist martyrs. So lots of movement of bodies and relics. So as Berezin, who I referred to before, has argued in her study of fascist political culture, rituals were vehicles of solidarity or communities of feeling in an ideological project. And I think that's really what we see in the case of Carisi and Ambrosoli, their kind of unwavering commitment to the fascist regime despite their distance from Italy, and their stoicism in how it was represented in the fascist press, their stoicism in the face of anti-fascist violence. These were tropes that were repeatedly referenced throughout both commemorative events and in the media. And their sacrifice was very much tied to this idea of fascist expansionism through the iconography and rituals of Italian American cultural memory that saturated ceremonies in both Naples and New York, and the kind of echoing of these two ceremonies on either side of the Atlantic. As with the early Christian martyrs who suffered at the hands of a powerful majority, organisers of the two funerals were able to represent the slain Blackshirts as a persecuted but powerful minority who remained steadfast in their commitment in the face of persecution. And they really celebrated their superiority in an attempt to kind of encourage mourners to emulate their commitment to fascism despite the geographical distance from Italy. So as Berezin said, with respect to rituals more broadly, these are kind of vehicles of solidarity to create communities of feeling, which I think is what we really see here. The funeral itself was enormous in Naples. Hopefully this video will play for you. And you can view footage actually online on Archivio Luce of the whole funeral. So you can just see how many people are attending here. But all shops and offices were closed for a day of public mourning, and a second funeral procession then occurred, taking the bodies from the port itself and into the city of Naples. And as I said before, we had these kind of markers of Italian and US national identity with the flags and the playing of various anthems associated with each nation. All ships that were docked in the port sounded their horns in honor of the dead, and there was kind of music played as the bodies were moved. So the scale is really enormous. And the procession went through the city from the port to Piazza del Plebiscito, which was named after the event that saw Naples incorporated into the Italian nation. So again, we see this idea of sort of nationhood, national identity and public space being used in relation to the martyrs. And they end up at the Basilica of San Francesco di Paolo, where they were blessed. And next up, Grandi, who was the Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs, stood beside the representatives of Italian and Italian American fascism, and speaking on behalf of the government, described Carisi and Ambrosoli as our martyrs for the fascist revolution. Addressing the dead, he said, "Carisi, Ambrosoli, you come from afar. You come from the sea to tell us that we die everywhere for Italy, because Italy is everywhere. To tell us that Italy has no borders, because our faith has no borders. Oh, how alive are these glorious dead." So the whole process of honouring the movement of their bodies and welcoming them back to Italy lasted for 3 hours. So I think we really see this kind of imperialist purpose to the two deaths. Carisi and Ambrosoli were remembered as having lost their lives on the streets of New York in the name of Italian fascism, in order to remind mourners that fascism could and should not be bound by the nation state. and in order to kind of celebrate their commitment to the dissemination of the ideology abroad. And this expansionist rhetoric made explicit what was suggested by the incorporation of the journey of the Conte Rosso into the commemorative ritual. So Grandi closed the ceremony with quite a sort of frightening call to arms. Black shirts of Italy, black shirts living under this sky, black shirts living beyond the border, beyond the Alps, across the sea, raise your flags, prepare to fire. So just to kind of conclude on the funeral, the narrative that was expressed verbally and performed through the processions made clear that they had lost their lives in order that collective commitment to Mussolini's regime in Italy and abroad might strengthen. This sort of public transnational ceremony or celebration on both sides of the Atlantic conveyed this particular ideological message, which was that death was part of a collective struggle and progress. And this progress of the ideology could not be bound by the Italian nation state. So just to go back to New York, it would take 6 weeks for any arrests to be made. Working with the Italian Secret Service, the New York police arrested 14 prominent anti-fascists on July the 11th, including Greco and Carillo, who were members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America and the Anti-Fascist Alliance of North America. They were charged with murder in the first degree. And we see kind of echoes here of Sacco and Vanzetti. And if we read The Labour Defender, which was published in the months of the trial, we can see direct parallels being drawn between their plight and the plight of these two men who were accused of having killed Carisi and Ambrosoli. So this double murder really stirred tension between fascists and anti-fascists in New York, and lots of rallies were held in their defence, attracting hundreds of people, with media reports suggesting that it was actually Mussolini and his policies that would be on trial rather than the suspects. The General Secretary of the Fascio all'estero, named Di Marzio, wrote to the American ambassador calling for them to be electrocuted, so direct in his demands. And at trial, the trial was presided over by someone called Judge Cohen, and he reminded the jury that whether Mussolini's government was tyrannical or excellent should not affect their deliberation. The pair were acquitted on the 23rd of December 1927, having been proven not to have been involved in this double murder, and no one was ever punished for the two deaths. So we see then that these national public holidays were really a focal point of fascist and anti-fascist performances of loyalty to the respective fascist or anti-fascist movements back in Italy, and of collective identity within North America. These national celebrations have been defined by Macron and Macpherson as commemorative devices in time and place for reinforcing national identity. So to permit participation of certain political groups in these events is really a sign of assent of the values that they represent. As a result, the inclusion of black shirts in the Memorial Day parade of 1927 was unsurprisingly contested by anti-fascists. Writing about this decision and the events of that day, Domenico Saldino, the Italian American writer who would later go on to become a councillor for the Italian Socialist Federation in the United States, wrote to Albino Zattoni, one of the organisers of the New York-based association, the Matteotti League. And in his letter, he expressed his discontent at the inclusion of fascist black shirts in further parades and national holidays in 1927. And he concluded, "But we will have our own counter commemoration, as we have in other years, and hopefully our loudspeaker will be more powerful than that of the black shirts." So we see this kind of almost martyr wars that emerge here. The fascists were not alone in commemorating their martyrs in public declarations of political identity, and anti-fascists did so too. And in fact, the principal sort of symbol around which the anti-fascists gathered to commemorate and protest the rising tide of fascism in America was Giacomo Matteotti, the sort of anti-fascist global martyr, who was commemorated heavily in the United States immediately after his death, when, of course, commemoration was banned in Italy under the fascist regime. So in 1924, there were events held to commemorate Matteotti that attracted tens of thousands of people. One in Boston, according to reports, attracted 70,000. And they were held throughout the US, so not just in the major metropolises, but in much smaller places as well. He was a sort of symbol of workers' emancipation and social equality that had mass appeal against the fragmented Italian American left. And he could really sort of unify quite a fragmented movement in the early 1920s. And we can see this in the image on the far right, this commemorative poster, which is addressed to the broad category of citizens, workers, and lovers of liberty, and declares the participation of political groups from across the left as an act of solidarity, showing the sort of unifying function of anti-fascist martyr memory. And these ceremonies were as much an occasion to protest fascist violence in the US as they were to commemorate Matteotti himself. So we see this kind of dual function of martyr memory, which is both to commemorate but also to condemn the killer. New York was actually the first location that I've found for a proposed monument to Matteotti, which was proposed in 1926, so quite swiftly after his death in 1924, when the newspaper Il Nuovo Mondo began a successful fundraising campaign to try and raise funds to erect a monument to commemorate Matteotti, but also to honour all anti-fascist supporters of liberty and freedom who had moved to the United States. But this, despite raising about $10,000 in 1926 currency time, this monument, which I've tracked all of the fundraisings throughout the year and a bit that funds are being raised in the US, but it never gets built, and there's no further mention after the closing of donations in 1926. And though it's unclear why it doesn't get built, I believe it's because of the increasingly public demonstrations of fascist support during national celebrations in New York public space at this time. And as we see in the case of the Memorial Day parade and the creation and celebration of the first Italian American martyrs, this was a particularly violent year in terms of fascist and anti-fascist struggle. But it was also a particularly public year in terms of the celebration of fascist identity in New York public space. And I think that the proposal to put a monument up to Matteotti in New York was probably considered too dangerous, as it might have become the kind of focal point, a sort of hotspot of further fascist, anti-fascist violence. So just to contextualize this a little bit within fascist martyrdom, more broadly, this is a subject that has really inspired critical inquiry among scholars. So Roberto Mancini's monograph Il martire necessario charts the evolving narrative of martyrdom from unification to the fall of fascism. Falasca Zamponi, Susi Vallis, Staderini and Foote have also considered the rituals and rhetoric of fascist martyrdom. But these are questions that have focused, or the research so far has focused primarily on the nation state, so commemoration of fascist martyrs in Italy itself. But these questions remain relevant today. Even 75 years since the end of World War II, people continue to gather at this mausoleum. It's called the Mausoleum of the Fascist Martyrs in Rome's Verano Cemetery, to honour the martyrs of the fascist revolution, continuing this sort of annual trend that began under Mussolini's regime. It was built, this mausoleum, in 1922. Sorry, it wasn't built in 1922, it was built to honour those who had died in 1922 during the March on Rome, in an attempt to kind of create this historical memory for a relatively new movement. They actually didn't have enough bodies to fill the mausoleum, so they had to hold lots of these ceremonial movements of bodies from other areas in Italy to kind of fill this mausoleum up. And I believe, I know within the mausoleum, the body of Inez Donati, who was woman was buried there. She was kind of, her body was moved there despite dying of tuberculosis. So she definitely wasn't killed kind of either during the March on Rome or in defending fascism. I think she's the only female fascist martyr. She's certainly the only one I've ever come across, but I might be wrong on that. So fascist martyrdom and the kind of study of the rituals and the rhetoric of fascist martyrdom is one component of what Gentile terms the secular religion of fascism. And through studying this, I think, through studying the rituals and rhetoric, it really exposes a diversion of religious aesthetics, rituals, relics and spectacle towards the nationalist project, both within Italy, but also the nationalist project as it was kind of projected abroad. So I hope that one day that I'll be able to use this research in a kind of wider examination of fascist martyrdom from 1922 up until the present day, to take in the kind of contemporary neo-fascist pilgrimages that still happen at this monument today. But I would also really be interested to take in, to do much more research on this idea of transnational fascist martyrdom, not least because somebody who I follow and who follows me on Twitter, Dr. Joseph Schura. So if you're listening, thank you so much for sending me images of this book, which was handed to him by an anti-fascist family, which documents the 45 dead and 283 injured fascists who either died or were injured abroad, which when I saw this, having already done this research and written this presentation, I got super excited about it, because I think it really points to the fact that there are many more case studies to be looked at here. And as Mussolini's regime was all too aware, transnational commemorative practices had this sort of propagandistic power to represent the cause for which the martyr died as global. So transnational martyrs were very useful symbols for Mussolini, especially in the early days, kind of building support for empire in the regime's promotion of its imperialist ambitions. I think that the funerals held for Carrisi and Ambrosoli, both in New York and Naples, and the coverage of that journey of their bodies across the Atlantic, which was a real kind of important part of the creation of this martyrological narrative. These ceremonies emphasize the fact that despite the tens of thousands of kilometers separating the martyrs from their homeland, their commitment to fascism was steadfast. These first Italian American fascist martyrs were important symbols in Mussolini's attempts to increase support in the diaspora and celebrate the power of fascist values to sort of burst through the confines of the nation state and take root in various diasporic communities outside of Italy. So I really hope to find further examples of these transnational martyr stories. Of the few pages that I've seen within this book, there are stories from France, for example, and I think Switzerland. It's definitely going on my Christmas list because I found a copy on eBay, and I hope that I'll be able to kind of push forward with this research once I've got my hands on it. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Harriet. I think if it's back over to you.
Coming back, yeah.
And I'll just stop sharing my screen.